On February 4th, 2026, the XRP Ledger quietly flipped a switch institutions have been waiting on for years. Not a new token, not a new partnership headline, a permissions layer. And if you understand why that matters, you start to see why open has never been the same thing as usable. Something important just happened on the XRP Ledger, and it's easy to misread it if you're looking for price catalysts or hype cycles. Permission domains are now active on the XRP Ledger as of February 4th, 2026. That's a concrete protocol change. But the real story is what that change finally allows the ledger to express. Recently, a regulated bank could not design an on-chain FX settlement flow on the XRP Ledger without inheriting unknown liquidity risk. Today, it can start designing one, even if it doesn't deploy it yet. Most people think public blockchains win by being fully open. Anyone can show up. Anyone can transact. Anyone can provide liquidity. That openness is treated as the end goal. Institutions don't see it that way. Banks, payment firms, and regulated financial actors don't avoid public ledgers because the technology is missing. They avoid them because the system can't prove control, permission, and compliance at the same time. And that disconnect sits underneath almost every debate about why institutional adoption feels slow. If you want regulated money to move on-chain at scale, speed and finality aren't enough. You need a way to say, these participants are allowed, these assets are allowed, and this liquidity meets compliance requirements. In this video, we're going to unpack what permission domains actually do, why Ripple's leadership has said the XRP Ledger DEX couldn't be used for payments without stronger controls, and why this upgrade has far more to do with institutional settlement plumbing than DeFi culture. By the end, the difference between a feature being activated and a system becoming institutionally usable should be much clearer. Everything here is for educational and entertainment purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. If clear, no hype crypto education helps you make sense of all this. Hit like and subscribe. It tells YouTube this series is worth showing to other newcomers, and it helps me keep building it for you. Here's the reality most people gloss over. A public ledger can be technically correct and still be institutionally unusable. Institutions don't optimize for ideological purity. They optimize for legal exposure, counterparty risk, and auditability. They need to explain who they traded with, why the transaction occurred, what controls governed it, and what would have prevented a prohibited actor from participating. In open crypto markets, liquidity is treated as a purely economic input. More liquidity is always better. In regulated finance, liquidity has a second property, provenance. Where did it come from, and can you prove it didn't originate from a sanctioned or restricted source? That's why a public DEX can be elegantly designed and still be unusable for regulated payments. Not because the DEX is flawed, but because the liability model is different. This is the fault line the XRP Ledger has been moving toward addressing. Not by abandoning openness, not by turning private, but by allowing public settlement to coexist with enforceable permissioning inside defined contexts. That's the problem permission domains are meant to solve. The cleanest way to understand permission domains is as an on-ledger access control layer. The XRP Ledger remains public. Anyone can still transact, but a domain can define a space where participants must meet defined requirements before interacting inside that environment. Those requirements can be tied to identity and compliance primitives, including the credentials work that came before this. The goal isn't to publish personal data on-chain. The goal is to prove eligibility under specific rules. For institutions, that distinction matters. They don't just need settlement. They need compliant settlement. They need to restrict who can access certain markets, who can provide liquidity, and who can receive regulated assets. Permissioned domains allow that to happen without fragmenting the ledger or forcing institutions onto isolated private chains. And this is where the common objection falls apart. When people say institutions will never use public blockchains, What they usually mean is institutions won't use public blockchains that can't express institutional controls. The XRP Ledger is evolving a way to express those controls while preserving deterministic settlement, a shared state, and composable liquidity. But that leads to an obvious question. If this capability matters so much, why couldn't Ripple already use the DEX for payments? David Schwartz has answered this directly, and the answer is more revealing than it sounds. Even Ripple can't rely on the XRP Ledger DEX for payments today, because it can't guarantee a prohibited actor won't be providing liquidity along the path. That's not a technical failure. It's a compliance reality. If a regulated payment routes through liquidity sourced from a sanctioned entity, the transaction may be valid at the protocol level, while still creating unacceptable legal exposure. That's why so much institutional experimentation has historically stayed off-chain or inside tightly controlled environments. Institutions could enforce permissions there. On open liquidity venues, they couldn't. Permission domains don't magically solve every compliance challenge, but they address the specific blocker Ripple's leadership has pointed to: the inability to control who participates in payment-critical liquidity. And once that blocker is addressed, a much more practical set of use cases comes into view. When institutional builders talk about decentralized exchanges, they aren't trying to beat centralized venues on latency. They're trying to make slow settlement markets behave like modern systems. Foreign exchange settlement, cross-border payouts, treasury rebalancing, corporate payments that don't shut down on weekends. That's where a DEX built for payments starts to matter. And it's also where Ripple's regulated stablecoin strategy fits. Institutions don't just want crypto-to-crypto swaps. They want high-quality regulated value units that can represent real currency on-chain and move between jurisdictions predictably. A permissioned environment is what allows that to function without inheriting anonymous counterparty risk. It's the difference between an open market anyone can touch and a compliant market where participation rules are enforceable, yet settlement still occurs on a shared public ledger. When permissioned domains went live, the institutional translation was simple. A public settlement layer gained the ability to host regulated marketplaces. Which brings us to the next piece everyone is watching. There's understandable confusion right now because permissioned DEX sounds contradictory. Decentralized settlement implies openness. Permissioning implies control. The XRP Ledger's direction suggests a hybrid: decentralized matching and settlement, with enforceable participation rules for defined markets. But timing matters. Permissioned domains are active as of today. The permissioned DEX amendment is a separate step and, as of now, remains in the voting process. That distinction is critical. Institutions don't onboard to narratives. They onboard to operational readiness. They need compliance models, enforcement hooks, and clear boundaries, not slogans. Permissioned domains are a prerequisite layer. They don't finish the system, but they make the next step possible. Zooming out, the architecture becomes clearer. Ripple's institutional strategy isn't a single product. It's a coordinated system. Regulated stable value, custody-grade controls, liquidity access, and deterministic settlement that can be audited. A permission layer on the XRP Ledger helps convert available infrastructure into usable infrastructure. It allows regulated value to move through compliant on-ledger markets. It supports institutional liquidity deployment without inheriting unknown counterparty exposure. And it aligns with the reality that compliance, not throughput, has been the primary gating factor for adoption. This is also where Ripple Prime starts to make sense, not as a trading product, but as the control layer institutions need to access on-ledger liquidity inside permissioned domains, while preserving auditability and regulatory accountability. This is where the conversation shifts from narratives to plumbing. If regulated actors can route settlement through a shared ledger while enforcing participation rules, the system starts to resemble next-generation market infrastructure, rather than retail DeFi. That doesn't guarantee timelines or volumes. But removing a structural blocker often matters more than announcing a partnership. Now for the part that keeps this grounded. An amendment going live isn't the same as institutions moving billions tomorrow. Adoption happens in phases: sandboxes, parallel rails, policy validation, small flows, then scale. Permissioned domains being active means the XRP Ledger can now support compliant market designs it couldn't fully express before. Whether institutions use it depends on who builds production-grade permissioned markets, who supplies compliant liquidity, how regulated stable value scales, and how regulators respond once real flows begin. That's why this moment matters. Not because it's loud, because it's foundational. So here's the contrast to leave you with. Retail culture treats openness as the finish line. Institutions treat permissions as the beginning. A public ledger becomes institution-ready not when it gets louder or faster, but when it can prove who is allowed to do what, under what rules, with what accountability, while still delivering deterministic settlement. Permissioned domains move the XRP ledger in that direction. They directly address the limitation Ripple's own leadership has acknowledged: the inability to rely on open DEX liquidity for payments without stronger compliance control. If the permissioned DEX path continues to mature, the ledger starts to look less like a speculative venue and more like a settlement substrate capable of hosting regulated markets. That's a very different way to think about adoption. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. This channel is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and is not financial advice. Always do your own research and keep the discussion respectful. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with a friend.